we tend to keep friends around us who are always on our side. We also need to be careful because we live in a time when there's a pharmaceutical industry that is pushing medication. In the contemporary world, when you're studying at a university in a city, it's most likely that you're out of balance with your mind, body, and soul.
As we begin our podcast, we would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations, the custodians of the land in which this podcast was filmed. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
We recognise the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people and the oppression endured by communities in Sudan, Congo and beyond. The legacy of colonisation continues to affect generations, profoundly impacting the mental health of those who confront these challenges. May Allah ease their suffering, grant them strength in their trials, and inspire us all to act with steadfast solidarity and kindness.
We also understand the impact this conflict is creating on the mental health for people in our collective communities. If you're in crisis, please contact Lifeline on 131144 or any of the other helplines listed below.
Can everyone hear us okay? Yeah? Awesome.
Testing. Testing. It's like, okay. This is interesting because I don't get to rewind. You get to see the bloopers, inshallah, when it's posted, but I think I rewind like maybe 3-4 times before we start. So inshallah, we'll just get started first.
Don't.
Oh, the microphone. Well, the most important part. 2 microphones. The very first question we have is the Islamic psychology field is something that is still emerging and expanding. How did you find yourself here and what was your journey like?
Short version of that question is I found myself here, like my path to Islamic psychology was really simultaneous with my path to Islam. So I converted to Islam, and I found Islam through my search for a psychology that had a science of the soul. So essentially, I was traveling the world for a long time, studying different religions and living with different spiritual masters and communities, and always with the intention of trying to understand the reality of the human being and what do these different ancient wisdom traditions have to understand the whole spiritual reality. So for me, when I was into psychology or approaching psychology, it was never this whole brain, mental health, cognition thing. It was more, I always understood the word psychology for what it means, studying the soul. And so for me, that knowledge was based in philosophy, cosmology, all of these things. And so it was that whole search for how do we understand the human being that I looked at all these traditions and I found that a lot of them had a lot of pieces, none of them seemed whole. And after I finished my master's in psychology, I was really just like, okay, how can I find literally a science of the soul to help inform my practice of psychology or therapeutic work? And it was then that I found this in Islam in more whole, more intact, and more in depth than any other tradition that I had studied or experienced, to the point that I was like, this is what I was looking for. And as soon as I sort of just dipped my toe in that ocean, it was obvious that this was the path, not only the path for my understanding of psychology, but for my understanding of myself in relation to God. So I embraced Islam.
SubhanAllah, I think that's, something that is great. And, there's always this idea that people find Islam so naturally, and it sounded like a very natural and almost instinctual journey to, taking your shahada and finding Islam. So, SubhanAllah, that's quite beautiful. I think I want to get kind of stuck into some of the questions that we're really itching to ask you. And while we were listening to your talk, the concept of Islamic obligations and the idea that, often it's a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the way that we, see that and overcome that is kind of our test, is our struggle. When our Islamic obligation, however, kind of is in clash with our mental health, or it's what is causing our issues with our mental health. So, for example, you might have a son who is really struggling to uphold his family obligations. Maybe, he comes from a difficult home and things like that, and he can't uphold, the filial piety that I guess Islam necessarily inspires within us. What is kind of how do we address that, perhaps, is the right question to ask?
Everybody nobody is given anything that they can't handle. And everybody's given challenges that will move them in a certain way that Allah knows is what is needed to put this person into balance and to come into the place that is going to allow them to face what they need to face and go through the developmental work that they need to do. And it's up to the human being, it's up to us to engage with that setup that Allah has created in a way that how we pass the test is how do we honestly reflect and come into submission, and the fundamental thing that we have of turning over our will to Allah. So within that, only Allah knows the reality of the state of our heart and what we have a notion of what's obligatory on face value in normal circumstances. But if we study the tradition and we learn from the fuqaha, we know that everything has contextual conditions. And so there are certain things that we think are, it's black and white. This is the answer. This is the Islamic law says you do this. But then if you talk to a faqih, first of all, we have different madhahib. So we already know there's different perspectives, all of which fall within what's permissible and allowable. But then we have, within each madhab, the science of usul al-fiqh teaches us to understand how do we come to the determination of that dispensation. And those are all extremely contextual. And so nothing is black and white. And so that can seem like, okay, well then where do we even know, how do we even know where to go from that? But this is why, in conjunction with seeking guidance from those who know how to determine these things, and the need for rightly guided people to help us understand that, we, in lieu of that, because we often don't have that, our role is to self-reflect and be honest with ourselves. And the only way that one can determine what is within their capacity and what is not is if they are, first of all, self-reflecting, and being able to, when we self-reflect, when we spend more time doing muraqabah and muhasabah, with watching the self and taking self-accountability, we will eventually, it doesn't happen immediately, we will eventually be able to determine what is from my nafs, what is from shaitan, and what is it being inspired in me from Allah that I can submit to that is right. And otherwise, we're sort of grasping at straws, thinking that, not really having an understanding of where our actual state of being is and what our station is. And so, I'm not sure if this is speaking to what you're asking specifically, but that's my answer for now.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely answers what I have asked, and it brings to mind what you said actually during your lecture, which is we should approach Islam transformationally, not transactionally. And I think a lot of the time that includes not seeing things so, I guess, black and white, as you said, and really understanding what can I do in this situation that I have the choice and the will to do, and not necessarily including our preconceived notions of the way we're meant to be just because someone's told us to be that way.
Right. I mean, like the Prophet ﷺ said that actions are by intentions, and that everyone will get what they intended. So that the notion of that is that we have to do our best, and we have to, the actions are important. We have to align ourselves as best we can with what is right, but we can't just get stuck on, like you said, just the external behavioral outcome. There's also a reality of the inner reality of how we're orienting ourselves to Allah. Right? Are we turning to Him? Are we seeking? Are we striving? Are we struggling? Then we're never going to get it perfect. But the idea is to be intentional and struggling.
Absolutely. When a lot of these questions are not as clear-cut, it's a lot of black and white and a lot of self-reflection. And you often hear about mental health and the stigma around mental health being discussed. But I feel like something that is sometimes kind of missed is people who are struggling with challenges that they feel like they brought on themselves. So someone who might be struggling with a test that is something that's testing their mental health, like an addiction of some kind, something that's inherently haram, and they want to connect with the Muslim community again and find help through that. So like an alcohol addiction, for example. I guess my question is sort of like, how do we remind them that they're always welcome to come back, and it's part of our faith and obligation to help them?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, right? Because we're constantly told that we should cover over our faults and cover over the faults of others. But what's important to understand, especially as we struggle to understand our relationship to mental health and well-being and creating supportive communities, is that I'll give you an example of Imam al-Ghazali in his Ihya al-Din has an entire chapter on the rights of brotherhood, or you could say the rights of sisterhood as well. And in this one, it's the whole book in the Ihya, and in one chapter, he's saying that we need to cover over our faults, never expose them, and cover over the faults of our brother or sister. And this whole thing is cover over, never reveal it, right? And then, that's it, that's that chapter. Then the very next chapter, he says, if you want to change, and change is the goal, to be self-aware, you have to uncover your faults. And so he makes the distinction is that the limitation of not showing your faults is in public. Is in the public sphere, you don't uncover your brother or yourself faults because there are social ramifications for that. But what he said is we fundamentally need spaces and relationships where there is a closed door relationship of sahba, where you have a pact with a fellow Muslim, Rafiq, somebody who is by your side as a companion, where you can expose your faults for the sake of striving to be better. So he gives an example and says that we tend to keep friends around us who are always on our side. They're always cheering on our corner. If we make a mistake or we do something bad, they're like, hey, you were right. You were right in this one. And they're always on your side, right? But he says if we had a scorpion in our clothing, and we wouldn't want a friend who just allows the scorpion to sting us. We would want a friend who says, hey, you have a scorpion, let me get it out so it doesn't hurt you. And so we should want the same for our friends when it comes to pointing out our imbalances or our character deficiencies, because even though, unlike the scorpion sting, which is going to only last a little while, the things that are a stain on your heart or covering over your heart are going to affect you in the long run in Akhirah. And so we need to keep friends, and therefore it extends to community that are safe spaces to be vulnerable, to recognize what it is we need to work on. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ said that the believer is a mirror for the believer. There's a function of reflecting, not only reflecting the reality of Allah, so we come into know Allah through the other, but that you're also reflecting what is in the way of you being with Allah, reflecting the nafs. And so I think just the answer, because we're talking about this in the context of community, is we fundamentally need to create spaces in our community that allow for vulnerability and a space where people can be safe to bring up things that are difficult and know that that's not going to be spoken about outside of that safe space.
Sounds a lot like Helping Hands.
Sounds a lot like Helping Hands. That's right, absolutely. Shout out Helping Hands. Helping Hands is our peer support program that we have. But kind of in relation to what we've just talked about, which is, I guess, the stigma around things that, or talking about mental health issues that should not necessarily be public. I think a lot of conversation nowadays about mental health within the Muslim community surrounds concerns such as depression and anxiety. And although these are very, very valid and prevalent issues within our community, some disorders such as schizophrenia and OCD of the sort are often harder to speak about, and there's a lot more stigma around them, especially within our community. I guess when we're looking at it from an Islamic psychology paradigm or framework, how are we addressing these kind of concerns within our community?
Yeah, this is a really important point because people confuse this whole thing because, again, we're ignoring the spiritual dimension. And so, traditionally, in Islamic culture or Muslim communities that were fundamentally grounded in an Islamic cosmology, which includes the recognition of spirituality, people in the community that were labeled as Majnoon, you could say a schizophrenic diagnosis would fall into that, right? These are typically people who don't function in a way that is normative, right? But remember, normative functioning is normative to the physical dimension, dunya, right? So we communicate in a way that makes you comfortable and me comfortable on this level of physical communication. And so what was always understood by the awliya, or the ulama and the shaykh, is that these people were special. That they're actually tapped into a spiritual dimension, and they're having a difficult time, specifically a diagnosis similar to schizophrenia. I worked a lot with schizophrenic people diagnosed with schizophrenia, is that they are not fully occupying their nafs. They're not fully in their, what we know as the self, that is where it's identified with ourself, that we can be comfortable in communicating the way that we're used to communicating on this physical level of engagement. They're sometimes tapped into things that are in this ghaibi dimension, this unseen dimension. And that oftentimes comes off in ways that are non-normative behavior. Right? They're talking about things that seem crazy because they're not here. We're not able to see that. They're not physical. That doesn't mean they're not real. It means that they're tapping into things and they're not able to bring it all into the same place and function in this way, right? And so if we see it from this different perspective, we need to be able to recognize that people who are struggling with these diagnoses could be more on a higher spiritual level than we are, and closer to Allah. And perhaps, in some cases, the scholars tell us that this could be a way that Allah is favoring this person by covering over what, when we are of our faculty of intellect, we are mukhallaf. We are responsible for our actions. Otherwise, we will come into be taken account. When you're not mukhallaf, then you're not held responsible. So it could be that Allah knows that this person, if they were mukhallaf, they would get themselves in trouble. And out of love and mercy, Allah covers this over for them so that they'll be in a better place in Akhirah. So this means that we need to expand our notion of where is the ultimate goal. Is the ultimate goal functioning in the dunya? No, because this is temporary, this is fleeting. The ultimate goal is our station with Allah in the Akhirah. And we need to expand our awareness of where we prioritizing and how we understanding health and well-being and wholeness. And then I guess, yeah, I'll leave it there. Because there's other aspects of that, there are biological reasons why some people have mental illness, and we need to treat those with biological means, but we also need to be careful because we live in a time when there's a pharmaceutical industry that is pushing medication. And so it's very easy for us to just diagnose people with these things that are medicated, and because there's a whole industry that is invested in giving medication. And so it's not to say we should never take medication. There needs to be a understanding of when it's appropriate. And that really, if we're looking at our own tradition, we should prioritize natural remedies over pharmaceutical remedies. But it's okay to use them in certain cases, and sometimes it's to put the physical body in balance so that they can then do that deeper spiritual balance work. It's not one or the other, it's not, it's a whole human being we have to take into consideration.
SubhanAllah, that's really, really interesting. Because I was thinking actually as well, with certain mental illnesses like OCD or maybe some kinds of addictions, part of the treatment is forgiving yourself. Or part of getting better is, knowing there's a way back from the sins that you might have committed. What do we have in Islam that reminds these people that the sins that they committed during this time or the actions that they took that they might regret or repent, inshallah, repent from, will inshallah be forgiven?
I think, this goes to all of us really, is we need to get out of we need to maybe not use the word sin. It's not a very Islamic rooted understanding, because this word really has connotations from Christianity and this notion of being born in sin. That's not what Islam believes, not what Islam posits. The human being is not born in sin. And any transgression against what Allah has told us is better for us does not preclude us from receiving Allah's mercy at all, at any point. Because Allah says, all you have to do is make tawbah. Making tawbah is not some complicated formula of it literally means to turn. Allah says, turn to me and I will forgive you. Literally, all we have to do is go like this. That's it. And forgiveness. And Allah has multiple names of His Asmaul Husna that are about forgiveness, because He is the one who bestows forgiveness. He grants forgiveness. And then He fully takes away the thing that He has forgiven. It's gone. So it's not, we need to dislodge ourselves. It's an aqeedah problem, really, when we think that our transgressions are somehow sins that are stains on our soul that we're stuck with.
I think that's honestly something that I find myself trying to reflect back on and keep reminding for myself is the vastness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy. I think a lot of the times as well, I think we should acknowledge that the way that sometimes we're taught Islam is through quite fear-based principles, and this can be really difficult for people to kind of understand the hope and the mercy that Islam kind of imbues within its practices. So subhanAllah, that was a great reminder, I think, for all of us about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy. I guess on the topic of mercy even, a lot of us as a collective community, we struggle with the collective trauma that we have faced. Things like, the conflicts in Palestine, Sudan, with the Uyghur Muslims. I think this sometimes really gets us down, especially within this dunya. How can we kind of come to understand these kind of more collective traumas and overcome them almost as a community, at least with the way we see them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a really big one. There's multiple ways that we need to approach this. One is understanding honoring the reality of people's collective trauma, that it's a really big obstacle, and that we can't belittle these things. They're fundamentally, not only on an individual level, can affect somebody's relationship with Allah based on the trauma they or their community has gone through. There's all kinds of studies now that are like legitimate academic studies that people are starting to take for real, that of like epigenetics, that there's actually a transfer of trauma that comes through genetics. So a person can actually be impacted by a trauma of a community, even if that happened before their time, and they're starting to understand that this is not just about learned behavior. It's actually this collective spiritual reality of being impacted on a deeper level. And so what that means is we need to understand the fact that we are, as much as we have to do our own work individually, and we all stand before Allah alone on the Day of Judgment. So there is no like collective, it's individual, but we have a collective reality in how we heal, how we process, and how we engage in the world. And that needs to be a part of the healing process. But also, the other point is that part of that healing, and part of the healing from the trauma, is that we need to, again, this is sort of correcting our aqidah, or our orientation to what's real, is we need to recognize that the true reality is beyond this temporary physical dunya. And we have a hard time making sense of horrible things that have happened to us or happened to our people, and say, well, how can this happen? How can Allah let this happen, right? And we need to trust that there's hikmah in everything that Allah has, and that the ultimate goal and the ultimate reality is not here. It's there. It's after this life, and that this life is brief. And so we tend to get so stuck and mired in this our identity of our culture and ourselves and our history that is, as far as we can remember, or our families can remember. And that's just it seems like a very long time from our perspective, but it's not in reality. And so what we need to do is start to root our orientation to self and community in our eternal identity as souls and slaves of Allah, who are in this place of tawakkul. Having tawakkul is not just on a day-to-day basis, but having tawakkul of Allah, this is in Allah's hands, and so this is part of how we have to heal. And I think oftentimes in the work that I'm doing of trying to heal individuals, there is a collective trauma that is sometimes the first piece that needs to be healed, because people, Islam, I'm saying, like in this presentation, Islam is the healing, right? But if your trauma is with Islam, the first thing that needs to be healed is your relationship to Islam. And this is why I'm saying we need to reorient ourselves to the deen. And part of that reorientation is not seeing it so much as an organized religion and dogma, because that's not how Allah presents it. We human beings make it an organized religion. It is the path. It is the deen. It's this deen al-fitra. It's just the reality of what is needed for the human trajectory to be healthy and whole. And we need to orient to it that way, and heal from the trauma that has been inflicted on corrupted hearts, being the ones who are, being the voice of presenting Islam to the people.
Well, I increase some of the welcome, inshallah. And we'll now head to the exciting segment, or more exciting segment, I think, for the audience, which is the questions that you guys have prepared. Surely it'll be very, very interesting. So I'll hand it over to Hannah, inshallah.
So there's actually quite a few questions, and subhanAllah, I think the only of the question really reflects about how much we're learning and really thinking about all of the things that Abdallah Rothman has introduced to us today. I really like this one particularly because it's kind of similar to what we were talking about just before. Someone asked, if everyone has these interconnected aspects of their being, does that suggest that within the Ummah, if one is out of balance, it can turn and affect all? As in, the interconnectedness of the self is not limited to the individual, but is a part of a larger network of human beings.
Yes.
Yes. Simple answer is yes. And we are told all of these things by Allah. If you kill one person as if you killed all of humanity, there is a collective spirit of humanity that we can't. This is why in Islam there's no monasticism. We're not meant to just go up on a hill and be on our own and reach perfection and heal ourselves. We have to be in community. We have to be in khalwa sometimes, for a small portion, to take care of ourselves, to heal ourselves, but then we spend most of the time in the jalwa. There's khalwa and there's jalwa. Jalwa is the social reality. That's what we spend more of our time in, because all of humanity is one body in this sense. And so yes is the answer.
We have another question here from brother. When converts take shahada, many of them realize the reality of the nafs. What are the steps/transitions converts can take to ease into acknowledging their nafs? It's a beautiful question, mashallah.
You said the first part of it? They do what?
So when converts take shahada, many of them realize the reality of the nafs. I guess they probably weren't aware of that aspect initially. And so what are the steps/transitions that converts can take to ease into acknowledging their nafs?
I don't know that it's any different than for all of Muslims, but because I think there's a lot of Muslims who aren't necessarily aware of their nafs either. So I think if converts are aware of their nafs, they could probably do a lot to help the community and engaging everybody in that process of being more self-aware. And maybe one of the things that we can do is sort of have convert care initiatives that invite people in to engage in a deeper orientation to Islam, other than just do this, do that. That there's this process of understanding the self and transformation. So like you're saying, the irony is a convert can come in and say, oh, I've just learned about this, I have all this work to do, right? But the irony in the reality of what Allah tells us is that when somebody converts, their soul is clean. Like everything is forgiven before that. And so they actually have less work to do. It's not that they still have the work to do, but somebody who doesn't have that, there may be a longer trajectory of having the work to do. And so I think that can bring to our consciousness as a community that it's being Muslim isn't just that you join the club and now look like, hey, welcome to the club. I've been Muslim my whole life, and now you have to catch up with me. It's actually work to actively become Muslim. And maybe by bringing attention to that process with converts, it can really benefit the whole collective community.
Yeah, and speaking about an initiative that's what helps convert, I just want to shout out Convert Collective, because they're doing just that, mashallah. It's a beautiful program, bringing converts together. And so I just wanted to shout them out today. And if you're a convert, please reach out to them. And inshallah, they can make that process easier. Goodbye.
Inshallah. That was a great answer. I think, again, it really requires a mindset shift from what we really think about normally. There are so many assumptions, I think, that are made about converts specifically, and Yeah, it's good, and I guess it's in the spirit of what we're talking about today, to not be so narrow in the way we think and think further than, or be critical in what we're trying to say and what we believe in. I have another question, and again, a very relevant one. As you mentioned, Dr. Abdallah, you mentioned the mind, body, and soul are connected. What can someone do if they feel as though that there's a detachment within this complex?
I think everybody feels that to some degree. If you're living in the contemporary world and you're studying at a university in a city, it's most likely that you're out of balance with your mind, body, and soul. And so, to be very honest, if you want to, the steps to come into balance with that is to look at people who live a more rural life, or maybe a more traditional life, not in the city, and maybe even not educated. I know that's a strange thing to say in university, but I find that there's less unlearning to do for people who are uneducated, not intellectual, and not chasing a life of getting a career to be successful and make lots of money. Because what are they doing? They're living a slower paced life, their hands are in the earth, they're waking up with the sun and going to sleep with the sun. They are spending time in nature all day long, and that fundamentally aligns your body, mind, and soul without having to think about it. You don't have to intellectually understand how to do these things if you live a fitri lifestyle, if you live a natural lifestyle. If we look at the Sahaba, the community around the Prophet ﷺ, and we try to say, oh, well, they weren't doing these things, right? They weren't learning how to breathe. They weren't doing breathing practices, because I often tell people they need to learn how to breathe in order to be in their heart and to be in a state of presence. And people say, well, where's the hadith that tells you how to breathe? Well, first of all, if you live the way that the Prophet ﷺ was living, it's fundamental to even just riding a horse. First of all, he tells us to ride horses, specifically. He says we should be riding horses, doing archery, swimming, and wrestling. All of these things you cannot do without having control of your breath. If you've ever, and diving, swimming, breath control, all these things. And then, so it's not you go to school to learn these things, you just do them, right? If you've ever ridden a horse, you cannot be on a horse without being in your body, connected to your conscious awareness, connected to this other animal, and connected to your breath. If you're not doing those things, you will be on the ground. So you don't need to be wise, you don't need to be knowledgeable, you just need to do the activity. And the activity puts you in balance. So this is when the Prophet ﷺ tells us to do what we call sunnah sports, but really we should call them sunnah disciplines, because they're important, they're not frivolous, it's not lahu, it's not a sport in the sense of a pastime. They are prescriptions for wellness and balance. And each one of them has a specific thing that puts our bodies, minds, and souls into alignment.
Again, just also shout out, we have archery session in Melbourne, it's a great organisation. This is not only a shout out, but I think
it's good to point people to these
absolutely,
resources.
because I
Sure.
think it's quite practical as well, in the way that you're kind of saying all of these things. But it's something that we in the Western society and in the digital age really, really lack, and it's something that is really hard to prioritise and put forward unless you put action and intent behind it. So I really emphasize or reflect and value what you're saying about reconnecting with nature, because it is so difficult in this day and age, like a lot of other things that we've discussed so far. I'm going to direct a comment though.
We've got another question. Can we expand on the idea we are more outputs? What is our relationship between our inner voice and the dialogue, and what does it represent? I guess I add a little part as well. In some ways, it's a reflection of our bits.
Yeah. So the way that we understand what we call thoughts, there's different parts of thinking, there's different parts of the intellect, and there is a logical, rational capacity of the human being, and part of that is located in the brain, right? There's a part of the brain that intellects based on logic, right? It takes logic, you take one thing, you hold it up against another thing, and you come up with another thing, right? There's a deep science of logic within the Islamic tradition, and it's very important. But it is one aspect. And then we also have khawatir. Khawatir is plural, khatir is singular, and we have, it means involuntary notion. So it's when something comes to you, right? Which we would call a thought. Oh, I had a thought, right? But we have different types of khawatir. There is khatir nafs, meaning it's coming from my own self, like a notion that comes to myself based on my own perhaps deluded thinking or my own desires or my own isolated way of being in my nafs. But there's also khatir shaitan. Shaitan can put a notion not in our heart. You know, shaitan can only whisper into our sadr, which is a more shallow part of our heart. It's in the same place, but it's our chest. And so we can confuse that with our heart, because this is part of shaitan's trick. He can whisper into our sadr, and we think it's our heart. But so this is why we have to do reflection in the heart, so we can determine the difference of khatir shaitan, khatir nafs, and there is khatir Allah. Allah can put a notion in your heart. This is ilham, or intuition. It can come into you, but there's also khatir malaika. Angels can put a notion. So Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah said that every human invention, every time somebody has a notion of, oh, I'm going to invent this thing, right? And then we give them credit for inventing it. It was a khatir. It was an involuntary notion. It could be a khatir shaitan, and somebody has an invention that destroys, kills lots of people, right? The atomic bomb maybe was a khatir shaitan. But then there's khatir Allah. And there's khatir nafs. So what we need to do is spend time reflecting internally, not here, because that's not where they come. There is a part of the intellect, like I said, that's up here, but that's just a process or a reflection of that. It's here that they come in. And so we need to spend time here so we can start to decipher what is what.
Absolutely, subhanAllah. I mean, I really reflect on the fact that we are not our thoughts, because to be honest, I transitioned into neuroscience in my last year because I really wanted to learn a lot more about my mind and how things operate, and subhanAllah, I ended up with a lot more questions, right? And that's why we're here now, subhanAllah. So, yeah, definitely, I'll pass it on to him.
Hi, Hamid. Unfortunately, what is going to be the final question of the night, but I do want to make this double-barreled, so I hope we can do that. So someone has asked, as a psychology student myself at this university, the Western perspective seems heavily focused on evidence-based treatments and their efficacy to treat someone. How do we integrate the practice of psychology here in the West in a manner that is harmonious with what Islam teaches us in this regard? And if we were to do this is my addition, what are places, literature, or resources that we can look to guide us to this place?
To the place of integrating them in the Western?
Yes, correct.
So, it depends on what Allah has put in your heart to where He wants you to place your focus in this world. There's nothing wrong with, sometimes we have to function within what is the mainstream in order to impact something. So there is no better. It's what's better for you based on where Allah has put you and what Allah has placed in you as your amana to bring forth into this world. And so it may be that you need to do work in the Western field of psychology to gently sort of seed a different perspective. And you may have to do that within evidence-based studies. And so there's a merit in still doing evidence-based studies. Why? Because a lot of people won't even take you seriously if you're not doing evidence-based studies. So it'd be great to have studies that maybe challenge the paradigm a little bit, but using their language to do so, right? My own personal, what I have found that where Allah has put me and what I feel inclined to and what I have to offer, I'm not really concerned with evidence-based treatments because I think that's where we're stuck. Like when the answer is always like, well, okay, give me the evidence. How can you say that if you don't have evidence for it? It's feeding into the problem, because what it's saying is we're still trying to use the wrong methodology. We're using a methodology that matches one dimension, right? Methodology of evidence-based treatment is only relative for the physical dimension. And in the physical dimension, that makes sense to use that methodology. But if we understand usul, if we understand methodology, how we understand method, there is a method for every body of knowledge. And so the body of knowledge that includes the spiritual reality, the unseen reality, evidence-based studies is the wrong methodology. You know, if it's like an atheist saying, give me the proof that God exists. Nobody ever said that God is supposed to be proved through physical existence. Like that's antithetical to the whole notion of tawakkul or iman, right? So I guess, again, I think we need to not be so limited by the language of just the physical dimension. And so what my work is to try to challenge that narrative and say, look, let's be reasonable and let's use the proper methodology for what we're studying. They call it psychology. So either keep the name psychology and let's use other methodologies that allow phenomenology and reality of it unseen, or change the name and don't call it the study of the soul if we're not going to talk about the soul. But I think people should, there's still room to use the language and the methodology of what people are take seriously in order to push the narrative a little bit.
Absolutely. I think that's some really great wisdom there. And as a student myself in clinical psychology, I think this is something that I've personally been wondering myself. And also to add on to what you've said, I think, and I talk about this with my mentor a lot, we don't really realise what people are seeking when they come to therapy, and whether we think that Islamic paradigm of psychology is the way or not. People are seeking a way to understand themselves. And I think that realisation really sets it into place for me when I put my practice of Islamic psychology in context with the Western, that sometimes people are trying to find something that they don't even know what it is themselves. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel like hopefully someone can take something out of that. But in saying that, Jazakallah khair everyone for joining us for our podcast recording and being a part of it. We appreciate your offerings and your questions, and subhanAllah, I think we've had a really robust conversation about the state of Islamic psychology within our communities and our societies, and I'm really, really keen to where these conversations go, inshallah, and where you all take this knowledge to as well. So if we can please give a round of applause for Abdallah.
Jazakallah khairan for listening to the podcast, and we hope you enjoyed this episode. To keep updated with the podcast and our other activities, follow us on Instagram @_6degrees and our website at www.6degrees.org.au.